Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our business growth webinar series. So, building and managing your cap table. This is Kennore's business growth series where we have expert guests come on and support businesses that are growing and scaling in best practice, what to do and how to set up yourself for success, whatever your end goal may be, whether that's an exit plan or whether it's passing on the business. So this morning's expert guest is Robert Dixon, who's a senior partner at Mason Hayes Curran. So Robert has supported us with a number of these webinars, and I can speak from my own experience that he is a wealth of knowledge. So I would encourage you to use the question and answer feature within the webinar. Do pose your questions and I'll use the Q&A or the chat feature and I will pose your questions on your behalf to Robert. It is important to note that this webinar is for general information purposes mainly. For specific advice, we always recommend reaching out directly to an expert and we'll share Robert's contact details at the end of the webinar. So I'll hand over to you, Robert, that you can get started there.
Great. Okay. Well,
Thank you
thanks
very
very
much.
much, Christina. And it's great to speak with Kenora and everybody again. We had a chat, myself, Christina, and some of our colleagues about what might be useful. And certainly one thing that I think the guys are seeing in terms of questions from some of Kenora's clients is around the cap table and what are some of the legal issues. Obviously, we're lawyers in Mason Hayes and Curran, so I'm a corporate lawyer and see all sorts of things on transactions and with clients at different stages. But the cap table is something that comes up. So I suppose the first question, and this is a bit of a whistle stop tour and hopefully nice and interactive, but what is the cap table? So it's the list of shareholders really that a company has. It's not a legal document as such, the cap table, in that it's not required under company law or anything like that, but it's a list of all of the shareholders that a given company has and what shares they hold. So how many shares do they hold? What types of share do they hold? What are the percentages? A good cap table could be really in an Excel or it might be in just a word list, but it should have all of that information. One thing that it's important that a cap table as well reflects is this point number 5 at the bottom there. So any options to acquire shares or safes and fully diluted shares. So sometimes you have this situation in a scaling company where there's options for, say, employees to acquire shares, but the shares haven't formally been issued yet. Or there might be, as part of a fundraising, there might be safes. We'll talk a little bit more about them later. But just that you don't simply list what's issued on in terms of the register of members, which I'll get to in a second, but that it's not just showing what's actually formally issued. It's what's been promised. What if somebody converts their debt into equity would be the position. So a good cap table will cover all of those things. It won't simply just it won't simply list, say, who the shareholders are. It gives that details about number of shares, class of shares, percentages. And I'd say what a cap table is, it's something that every company should have. There should be, a list of who owns the shares because it can get complicated, and therefore
Mhm.
it's very important that you don't ignore this crucial piece of information.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really helpful, Robert, for setting businesses up to have one of those key pieces, that when you go to meet with an investor, they're going to ask for that right away, right?
Yeah, they're going to ask, and I think that the problem is, and there can be different situations, different clients with different minds that work in different ways. And sometimes
Hmm.
what we see is these brilliant founders, brilliant entrepreneurs that have done such an amazing job in actually starting a business and making money from that business or scaling it. But sometimes these types of things aren't number one on the agenda, quite understandably. But it's not one of those things to ignore, just as I would also always say, documenting how intellectual property has been created is not something to ignore, and make sure that it actually sits in the company. It's your cap table is absolutely crucial, register of members, the record of who owns what. you need to have. You can't be going around, writing checks that you can't cash or promising people equity that you haven't any record anymore of what's happened there. So there's a few points just to cover on this particular slide here. So keeping a careful
Mhm.
record of all shares issued or promised. Is there a contract? Is there something in somebody's contract they've entered into with the company that actually on the fulfillment of certain milestones that they're entitled to some shares or something like that. You need to keep that record. It might be quite simple, really, but you just need to have that. And if somebody is supposed to be the 50% shareholder, that it actually says that in the formal record. And that's the next point I'll get to here. So we talk about the cap table, which, as I said earlier, is not actually a legal um, creature, if you like. So the
Mhm.
register of members is the legal thing. So for an Irish company, and you are supposed to have under law a register of members, and that's the formal record, if you like, of the legal shareholders of the company. So that's something that with the company books you're supposed to keep, and it is something that we sometimes see overlooked, that just there isn't that information sometimes out there that this is something that you have to do. And actually that's the formal record of who has title to the shares. I think the cap table is something beyond that. It's sometimes a bit more extended. I mean, your register of members won't talk about percentages, for example. Your register of members won't have options to acquire shares, for example, if there's anything like that out there. Whereas I would expect a good cap table would have those things. But the register of members, as I say, is something a company, every Irish company has to do. You're supposed to do it under law, whereas the cap table isn't actually legally required. It's just something that we would very strongly advise is useful and
Yeah.
necessary. Um,
And Robert, that's an interesting point that you make there because there's a lot of statutory registers that a company is obligated to maintain, right? And so when you're dealing with a corporate law firm like yourselves, obviously you're going to be supporting clients and making sure their housekeeping is all up to date and all of their registers are up to date. But see for businesses that are in the early stage and indeed even scaling and that maybe haven't thought of this or don't feel that it's as important as keeping on top of revenue and reporting their VAT and corporation tax, which is something that we would see often with businesses that are just busy in the doing sometimes. Would you say that the importance of having a qualified company secretary, keeping the business compliant and explaining all of these obligations to you regularly, is something that a business shouldn't overlook?
yeah, I totally agree with that about, the importance of a company secretary. And again, sometimes you want to get a message through. I keep going back to the point about making sure that your intellectual property is within the company.
Absolutely.
So that's just an example of if you can't do everything perfectly at the beginning, which I totally get,
Mm.
that's something to not get wrong. Again, I would put in a similar category, make sure you have a register of members, which is the legal position of what who holds the shares. And with that, I'd say not having an understanding clearly in writing and what I'll go on to speak about as a single source of truth
Right.
on your cap table. You need to know who your shareholders are. You need to know
Yeah.
who owns what. Otherwise, you could get into a big dispute with somebody and there could be a lot of trouble down the road for you. So it's really important that you can't do everything, but I think there's certain things you have to do, and this is one of
Yeah.
them. I really don't think there's any room for overlooking this. You have to know
Mm.
who your shareholders are. It has to be clear, and you need a register of members because that's a requirement. That's the formal legal instruments around it.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, the other thing I've said there, ensure the company's registration office record is up to date. So that's when you do certain things, when you issue shares in the company, you have to make a filing to the company's registration office. And that's the public record people see. So, there are things like penalties and so forth. And I think part of that is an optical piece because if you are looking for investment, or even if you're entering into a contract with somebody that isn't in the nature of investment, they'll have a look at your CRO records. And if you
Course.
see a bunch of red and, you've missed your annual return filing and, it's just a bad start. It doesn't look good. So having those things in order is important as well.
Hmm.
And just to have some awareness around it. I mean, for example, if you issue shares in a company, you're supposed to give the investor a share certificate. And then if
Right.
somebody is surrendering shares, they're supposed to surrender the share certificate. So just to be aware, people sometimes, if they don't know or they're not as experienced with it, might think the share certificate is kind of, I think in some jurisdictions it probably is the be all and end all. It probably
Mhm.
isn't in Ireland, but it's
Mhm.
still just to be aware that that's what's supposed to happen next if you issue shares. So that's one of the steps.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And
and
Robert,
yeah,
if a client is working with you guys, do you take care of all of that, all of those elements for them as well, in terms of all of the share certificates and the filing with the CRO,
yeah.
or would you still, yeah, you do.
Yeah, we
Perfect.
can. I mean, we do that. Like, there's clients that we do different. We do everything for, and clients that
Yeah,
they might pick and choose what they would like us to help with,
right.
which is fine. And those services, we have a playbook, and we can do
Hmm.
within that. But certainly, yeah, it's something we do in
Yeah.
terms of share certificates and the rest. Um, just the last point there then is I've mentioned this single source of
Hmm.
truth. So
Yeah.
it goes back to the point I made about, you have all these, you might have options to acquire shares or different arrangements in place where it's not very simple. So what we see is some service providers such as Carta, when your cap table starts to get a little bit complicated, they pull all that together quite well. And a lot of kind of fast growth companies that have gone through rounds of investment and that, they do use that card as an example, just because I've come across them myself. But there's, I'm
Okay.
sure, different providers out there. But that can be very useful in terms of allowing investors to click into something and see, what is the cap table at the moment.
Hmm.
If there might be 15 shareholders, for example, in your
Hmm.
company, and they have these different classes of shares. So it puts it all together quite nicely. And it's important, I think, if you're an investor, it's probably not a place you want to be, not having full visibility of who owns what in the company, and worse still if you're the company and you don't know. So something like
Yeah.
that can be quite useful if you have different instruments and things out there.
Yeah. And you touched on that a little, Robert, and you mentioned at one point if, there's a shareholder that always has to own 50%. The cap table can protect that somewhat, can it, by displaying, okay, this shareholder has to own 50%. So if we're selling more shares in the business, then we have to also allocate more shares to that business owner or whatever it may be, so that or do you use different share classes? Maybe it would be helpful to talk through that. Is that what the cap table would be used for as well?
Yeah, of course. I think there's a cap table around understanding control, I suppose, and,
Hmm.
and majority ownership. I think there's sometimes in the actual documents, the investment agreement, the shareholders agreement, the constitution, there can be rights that attach to, both there are legal rights, I suppose, anyway, under company law, but then there can be particular veto rights that you have if you own a majority. So certainly the cap table, it's really important when you go to look at those things to really understand how all that plays together. Sometimes as well, you mentioned the 50% piece there, Christina, but
Hmm.
there's also qualified, there's an ability to block if you have 25%. So a lot of that can come into it, understanding the groups that could vote together if you get into that situation where you have multiple shareholders. It's cap table to have a really good understanding, particularly as a new investment comes in. How's that
Mm.
going to change the dynamics, and what are the veto rights in the constitutional documents? So again, yeah, it goes back to really understanding what the shareholder base is.
Great. Okay. Thank you for that, Robert.
Okay, and I think then, like, linked to the cap table, I suppose, if you're getting an investment, I suppose, is the backdrop to this slide, whether you're issuing shares or not, and if so, how many. I suppose this takes a step back slightly in saying it needs to be the appropriate proportion of shares based on post money value of the company. So it's not always, just to reiterate that point. If I have a given company, you won't always issue shares at par value. Sometimes there will be a premium attached to each share. And the important thing is that if you have a company that post investment is going to be worth, I'll throw a number out, 5 million, you
Hmm.
know, if 2 million is being invested here, the 2 million should only equate, if it's going to be equity shares, to 40% of the shares in total. And that may mean that 40 shares are being issued at €1 par value each, and then you have a premium on each share above that. If 2 million in total. So it's just to make that point. And then also always if you're taking investment, are shares the appropriate instrument? They're not the only instrument out there. It may be that some sort of hybrid debt, it may be that just a loan in is appropriate. But then as a company, if you're taking that in, obviously you have to repay it. And it may be that you have to repay
Mm.
every month. And that's not, an ideal thing, maybe if you're in a scaling situation. Whereas equity, you don't have to pay back, so to speak. It's just that when it comes to an exit event, they will take their share of that, and it may be a far greater share than they would get by just having their debt paid back. Hybrid is interesting. It's kind of you I suppose there can be preference shares, for instance, that have kind of debt-like elements to them, where you get this coupon every year, or a dividend, a fixed dividend that is due on those shares every year, and it might mean that
Right.
you don't have the same equity rights on an exit, or if you're in a strong position, you might get that. You might get both. So you might get preference shares that give you a priority on exit to get your money back, but also all along you get this dividend that's like getting interest on your debt. So it's um these things are all kind of up for negotiation, and it just depends. You could have a number of different investors fighting over each other to try and make investment into a given company, and you kind of take what terms you can, or the company might be desperate, and you can kind of name your price, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. That's really interesting insight, Robert, and that what the different options are and how to go about that, and obviously weighing up the cost benefit analysis of each of them, um, and appreciate that a business that is maybe, cash tight needs the investment urgently, to grow, could seek and, give away too much equity very easily because they just need the funds, right? But that's where you guys come in and support and I suppose advise essentially on what all of those options are, I presume.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, listen, with those things, it's just making sure that somebody understands what they're agreeing to. I think what we have to
Mm,
do is totally understand that there's different situations, that the optimal outcome in what's agreed in the documents won't always be achieved. But there's negotiation, and then there's just understanding. I mean, something like you've mentioned there, Christina, that goes to value, and it's so important that you
yeah.
understand what you're giving away. I think sometimes term sheets can come in from investors, or there can be value points that you really have to be aware of what you're agreeing to there, because you can kind of um in the kind of rush or desperation to take investment, you can give away something that's actually far more than what the investment should be worth. So it's just being aware of it while understanding
Yeah.
that there are negotiation realities.
Yeah, and then there's a lot of horror stories out there, right, where people have taken on investment in a particularly early stage and then inevitably diluted their own ownership so significantly, where they at some points lose their business entirely or certainly become a minority shareholder in something that they built up. So there's
Yeah,
there's a lot of things to take into
there's that.
consideration.
I mean, I agree. I think that the thing that's I'm almost more worried about with that, Christina, is let. I mean, there will be dilution if you're taking on investment. You're going to get diluted now. Obviously, you want to watch that the dilution isn't more than it should be based on value. My
Yeah,
concern tends to be more around what are the other terms with the investment? Um, you
right.
know, for example, just to throw one thing out that I've seen become an issue later on that would raise red flags for me if I'm acting for an investee, if you like, or a company.
Mhm.
If the business isn't performing at X level over the years, we can do X, Y, and Z. We can flood the board. We can take extra, convert something into something else. It's those
Right.
types of things you really want to avoid, if at all possible, and it's kind of quite an aggressive term. So it's just things
Yeah.
like that to kind of understand what's a typical term of investment and what's actually a bit aggressive and unwelcome and to be avoided.
Yeah. Yeah. That's helpful as well. Thank you.
Cool. Okay, so and then there's just being aware with different types of shares and investments.
Mhm.
Ordinary shares are as plain vanilla as you can get. Just everybody has the same. If a company just has ordinary shares, then the founders, the investor, whoever has the same shares. What preference shares essentially mean is that whoever by definition, obviously, if you have preference shares, it means you have different types of shares in the company. You'll have ordinary shares and preference shares. Really what it means is when you're selling or when there's any type of insolvency or when there's an exit event, so to speak, the preference shares get the first dibs on the money. So if a investor has come in and, to go back to my last example, has put 2 million in at a certain stage, at that time everybody agreed that the value of the company was 5 million, but then we go and we sell the company 5 years later, and unfortunately the whole thing is valued at 2 million and it's sold. If you have a preference share, usually what that would mean is that 2 million goes all to the preference shareholder and the ordinary shareholders get nothing. So that's kind of what we mean when we talk about a preference share.
Right.
It shouldn't be relevant because as long as you sell for your 10 million, having been valued at 5 million, then everybody wins and everybody makes double their money, so to speak.
Hmm.
But it's just that you get the first dibs if things don't work out as you'd like.
Okay.
Um, Redeemable share. So you can have preference redeemable, redeemable that have redeemable and preference rights in them. But what redeemable shares means is that as the holder of that share, I can go back to the company under whatever the terms are and have them paid for essentially by the company itself. So it's more like debt, I suppose, in some ways than an ordinary share. So that's just part of it. You can have non-voting ordinary shares. So it's economically the same as an ordinary share, but you don't get a vote at the general meeting, so you can't direct how things happen. Golden shares, people use the phrase golden share and mean slightly different things in different scenarios, but really what we're talking about there is um, you don't have the same economic rights if you hold a golden share, but you do essentially have the right to control the board. So it's that's usually what's meant by it, and it's used in different scenarios to get around different uh, company law issues or regulatory issues and things like that, where there's actual control from a certain shareholder. But it's you don't have the same economic rights as I mentioned.
Hmm.
Convertible debt. So what that means is you essentially have debt. You make a loan into the company, but you can convert it into shares um, if you want at a certain point under certain conditions. Loan notes, that's a different word really for straight debt that somebody holds in a company, and loan notes are issued by the company. I've said straight debt there. It's just what it says in the tin, a loan from the investor into a company. And I've just mentioned at the end there, it's not a different type of share as such, but the share rights are set out always in the Constitution. So that's where you find what the rights and obligations of each class of shares are.
Yeah, we have a question in from James, and it's just for setting up when you're planning on international growth. And I think it's a question around issued shares versus authorized shares. So
Yeah.
he's asking, what's the right starting point or best practice with the amount of shares in a new limited company? Some recommend 100, others 1,000, and for international aspiration growth, what should you? I assume he's asking there on what you should authorize to allow all of
Yeah.
that future expansion, and then what you should issue to yourself.
Sure. So there's a couple of points in there. So first of all, nowadays, since the Companies Act 2014 came in, there is still a concept of authorized share capital, which is the number of shares you're allowed to issue. But actually, for a limited, an LTD, you don't need to have an authorized share capital. So you can just say we have ordinary shares, and you can issue as many as you like, subject to the Constitution. So the first question we would tend generally, unless there's a good reason, not have an authorized share capital. Issued share capital, of course, you have to have that. And the question is, how many shares should you issue at the beginning? I think the only really, from a legal point of view, it doesn't matter at all. Like we don't, it doesn't make a difference. Um, the thing you have to watch out at a later stage is just proportions. So, the more shares that are sitting there, the more flexibility, if you like, you have on the number of shares that will be issued and what percentage they get. If you only have one share sitting there and then someone's coming along to make an investment, you'll have to issue more to yourself to kind of balance that, and that can get a bit tricky if you're not planning to sort of pay for them what the person investing is. So I would probably
Mhm.
say really it doesn't matter, but I think yeah, I think probably if I had to just off the top of maybe 1,000. But just to
Mhm.
watch you, you kind of if you're planning to have, €1, for example, um nominal share capital, you have to actually pay €1,000 then. So it's just whether there's any need to do that, or what your plans are for initial investment. But really, the answer on the legal side is it doesn't really matter.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Appreciate that, Robert. Thank you. Hopefully that's helpful to you, James.
Okay. All right. And I'm conscious we're almost out of time, but I'd say with the
Mm,
cap table, some pitfalls. Make sure that if you have an agreement to issue shares, it's clear and it's in writing. This is something we come across. I talked about checks that you can't cash. Don't be promising things orally, because you can get yourselves. The company could actually be worth a hell of a lot of money later on, and high court disputes have arisen from such things.
wow.
So oral or unclear agreements can cause disputes. As I've said, if you have employee incentives, just be really conscious of tax. Structure them in a way that doesn't involve a big tax event up front, because it can do if you do it wrong, or maybe it's unavoidable, but just don't fall foul of that horrible and murky world which is tax. I've also said there, just structure them if you can, so a nominee or company can take key decisions. What you don't want is to issue a pile of shares, excuse me, and that a load of employees have the right to kind of stop the progress of the company. So you just be careful on that. If you can put it all through a nominee company that actually makes the decisions, and the employees just have economic rights. I've mentioned safes a couple of times, so simple agreements for future equity. These are things they came out of the Y Combinator on the west coast of the US, and they're very simple things where you can get money in the door, and they're very company friendly. Just ensure it's covered in your cap table, and just be careful with too many shareholders. It can be difficulty obtaining signatures. So the more you can hold them via a nominee, the nominee signs things. That's the way to do it. Um, Sorry, I see that there's another question has come in there, Christina. I
There
think we
is.
don't. Yeah.
Yeah, I can. So I have a question from Amy. Can I ask if a cap table can be used as opposed to a company register in certain situations, e.g., bank requests, or if a full company register would have to be provided?
Yeah, so I think the legal position is that there has to be a register of members. Whether you have a cap table or not, that's not a legal requirement. I would say it's legally required and an absolute priority to have a register of members. I would say, just as go back to the IP point, I think
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I'm sure a cap table would work. I think when the bank asks you for something, it's probably not a day-to-day corporate lawyer that's asking you. It's somebody that just wants to be able to see if you can send them something formal that they might want it sort of signed off by your lawyer or your accountant or something. But I'd
Hmm.
say that probably could be used day to day. I wouldn't. But so yeah, I think the answer is yes. It could be used in certain situations, and it's actually what investors would want to see. They won't really know what a register. Well, sorry, that's wrong. They'll know what a register of members is, but they'll have more interest really in seeing cap table. I see there's another question or two,
There
Christina. I
is,
might jump straight
yes.
in
So,
as opposed
yeah,
to the last
yeah, of
slide.
course.
So, how can you release or liquidate equity? When can you release equity back to yourself? So there's company law restrictions that the company has to have a thing called distributable reserves to do that. So first of all, your shares have to have, there has to be an ability in the constitution for the company to buy them back, but then the company has to have um, the ability to do it. That doesn't mean cash in the bank. That means distributable reserves, which is accumulated profits less accumulated losses. So the company needs to be able to show that either in interim accounts or your latest financial statements that it has the money to do that, and then the board of directors needs to approve it. So there's a couple of steps, and you want to avoid getting into a situation that you don't do that. And I think the rest was just part of the same question: to release a payout to yourself as a
Mm,
founder, personal debts. Yeah, fair enough. So I think the other way to do it, of course, is to pay a dividend. These are all things to check with your tax advisor, but if you own the shares in a particular company, you can, of course, pay a dividend up at any point if the directors approve that. So that might be more the more typical route to that than buying back shares, but either are potentially open as a way of getting cash out to the founder.
Great. Thank you for that, Robert. And thank you for everyone for their questions. Was there anything that you wanted to quickly cover for anyone who can stay on, Robert, on preparing for investment or sale? Any sort of
No,
key takeaway?
I think we've talked about the main things. Just make
Hmm.
sure your register of members is written up. I think don't have people hanging out there that think they have a rights to the company, shares in the company that don't. I think that's the main takeaway there.
Yeah. Yeah, perfect. Great. Thank you so much for your time, Robert. As always, such an informative session. And thank you for all of our attendees for their engagement as well and for sending through some questions. It's always hard to manage to get so much of this information into 30 minutes. So thank you so much, Robert, on taking us on that whirlwind tour of cap table and shares and those pitfalls to avoid. So the feedback there is lovely from everyone. So they've certainly found it helpful. Really appreciate your time, Robert, and hope everyone has a great day now.
Thanks very much, Christina, and thanks all.
Thank you. Bye
Cheers.
bye now.